And what I'm going to do is pitch this important conversation around housing to my colleague and other distinguished panelists, Bree Newsom Bass, and she's going to ground us around what the statewide housing coalition has been doing, or network has been doing.
Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. I think this conversation is so critical and important. And what we want to do with our time is, talk specifically about housing because this is such an important issue. It is very much tied to the ability to protest injustice and to challenge unjust laws and policies. And so, like many other issues and people who have been speaking today, that effort is under threat by attempts to suppress the right to protest. I'll give some background on that. We're having a technical issue. We're trying to connect with someone who could share firsthand what it is like to experience this kind of injustice, because I think that is really important to hear. This is an issue that impacts thousands and thousands and thousands of people in our state, millions of people nationwide. One of the most eye-opening things to me getting involved in this work is how many of us are on the cycle of housing instability and don't even recognize it sometimes. That was one of the most, like I said, kind of eye-opening conversations that I had with someone when I got involved in this, because I think a lot of times when we think of the issue of housing, we think of homelessness, and we think of homelessness as someone living on the street. And if I'm not, at the point where I am on the street with literally nowhere to go, then maybe the housing issue doesn't impact me. But so many of us can be placed somewhere on the cycle of housing instability, either currently or at some point in our lives, where we are either struggling to make the rent, we are staying on someone's sofa because we can't afford, we can't afford to live by ourselves on our own, or we might be just one lost paycheck removed from housing, from being without housing, excuse me. And then we want to close out. We have Yolanda Taylor, who's already been introduced, and Jamie Paulin. They are both fierce legal advocates on a daily basis. They are helping people who are faced with these issues, who are fighting eviction, who are fighting unfair treatment by the entire system on a daily basis here in North Carolina, to just talk about the whole concept of an unjust law and policy, and the fact that just because something is legal, just because something is standard practice, doesn't mean that it's right. And if we don't have the ability to protest or challenge those things that are unjust, how do we possibly address it, right? So I like to start by just sharing like why I fight, like why I show up to an issue, right? I ended up getting involved in housing specifically in the aftermath of the uprising in Charlotte in 2016. I know a lot of people, if they are aware of me, it's probably because of 2015 when I did the action of scaling the pole in South Carolina and taking the flag down. But even before that, I was involved as an activist in North Carolina, did work around a lot of issues, including voting rights, another thing that is, of course, under attack right now, I'm sure has been spoken about today. But then in 2016, like a lot of other cities, like we've seen, and I'm sure y'all have memories of, we had an uprising in Charlotte, in the aftermath of police killing Keith Lamont Scott. And what I realized in the aftermath of that was like, there are all of these issues that we are facing, whether it's voting, education, policing, the utilities being too high, right? And we're trying to address it, but at the same time, our communities are being completely upended and displaced. Like at that point in time, I was staying with my grandmother because again, I was one of those folks, I couldn't afford the rent in Charlotte on my own. I couldn't afford to live on my own. And so I was staying with my grandmother, and my grandmother was also at risk of being pushed out of her home because her community is being gentrified. She's one of the people that's living in a community that has been historically Black. It's like elderly people that have been living there since the 1940s and 50s have been denied economic investment from the city for all these decades. But now that it's like prime real estate, because people want to move from the suburbs back to be closer to uptown, everybody's getting pushed out of their homes. And now you have $400,000 homes going up next to my grandma's $100,000 home. She's getting calls and texts every single day from people trying to buy her house. They show up and they say, we'll buy your house in any condition. And in some ways, it may seem like a good deal, but what's really happening is we are constantly being undervalued. We are constantly being denied the opportunity to build wealth through our homes. So that's where I was. And I realized that, we can organize around all these different issues. But if the community that we are trying to build with is displaced, then what have we organized? We'll look up 20 years from now, we will have fought for a transportation line to come to a neighborhood to serve people who are no longer there. We will have fought for protections for a voting precinct when the people are no longer there, right? We'll have grocery stores and youth centers and all these things that we've been fighting for, but the people are no longer there. And then we're dealing with the same issues in another place. So that was what kind of like brought me to the situation. I started organizing a citywide coalition in Charlotte, because the other thing I noticed is that we tend to do a really good job of working in silos or in our like community groups, right? Doing really great work. But when it comes to things like housing policy, these, zoning issues, these are like high level conversations. They happen in the tall buildings right downtown. We are not invited in the room. They lay out plans 20 years in advance, and we don't find out until, the few months before they're about to act on their development plans. And so there was no way that we could really combat that unless we started working together in larger coalitions, unless we really started strategizing our own agenda and started acting on our own agenda. So that's how I got involved in that. And then with the statewide network, which is who we are right now speaking to you, we realized in Charlotte that these policies that we were trying to address in our neighborhoods and then, a local level, a lot of the policy we were running up against was being passed at the state legislature. So we couldn't even address things that were happening at a local level if we couldn't effectively shift policy at the state level. And that's very hard to do unless you are connecting with folks who are facing the same issue around the state. And so that's how we came together and really started working in this way. And then in 2020, the pandemic hit. So we went from a situation where we were already in a crisis to a situation where it just escalated exponentially. And all of a sudden, we're looking at thousands upon thousands of people possibly being evicted from their homes. And so we started working together to push for the eviction moratoriums. I'm sure you've seen where those went into place. Those only happened because people organized and protested, right? And, we wrote letters, we held press conferences, but we also had to show up, not just in North Carolina, but around the country. People had to show up and protest in person in order to prevent a lot of those evictions from taking place. And even still, and this is something that Yolanda and Wendell, who has experienced firsthand, and Jamie will share with you, even still, we had issues of people facing eviction, even though these policies had been put into place. So there was never a time where we could simply relax and say, okay, we don't have to do more. We don't have to show up. We don't have to protest. We don't have to respond. Beyond the immediate issue of the pandemic and trying to prevent people who are facing eviction in the short term, we are really looking towards changing the laws and policies themselves. We want there to be a housing bill of rights, right? We believe that housing is a human right. And some people, they say, okay, I think housing is important. I don't think that people should be without a home, but I don't understand this concept of housing being a human right. I don't understand this idea that absolutely no one could be without a house. How can you have a policy like that? Well, we've got to look at the whole context that we are living in, right? In terms of like grounding this space, I want to remind everyone that we are living on land that is occupied land. This is land that was stolen from the indigenous nations. This is land where, and many times we were brought here as landless people. We did not own the land. We were brought here to work the land. We were brought here to make the land productive, to make the land profitable. And then in the aftermath, we have been denied any kind of ownership of the land. people often point out, just because you are quote unquote a homeowner doesn't mean you actually own your home. You are paying to the bank every month who actually owns your home. And God forbid something happens where you're not able to make your mortgage payments, you end up being in the same position as tenants where you can be pushed out of your home and you can lose your housing. So this is an issue that affects all of us. And what we want to see long term is a housing bill of rights, something that is written into the law that gives us protection, that gives us guarantee, that acknowledges that a house, a home is one of the most basic things that you need in order to survive and thrive as a human being. And I think beyond that, it's really important to also recognize how the constant denial of housing stability is one of the keys of oppression and the ways that we experience oppression in this society. So, kind of going back to what I originally said, my realization as an organizer living in Charlotte, North Carolina, and trying to address a lot of issues. Think about all the things that having a home does for you, right? You have a place to rest, you have security, you have lights, you have access to clean water, assuming you have safe, stable housing, right? Then on top of that, you have neighbors, you have community, you have people that you can build with, you have a sense of identity and a sense of stability, right? By constantly denying us that, by making it very difficult for us to secure that, that is what makes it very difficult for us to achieve everything else that we're trying to have, whether it's good schools, access to nutrition, the ability to vote and really organize ourselves. If a community is constantly kept in displacement and instability, you can't build, you can't organize yourselves. So there's a deliberate reason why they try to prevent us from having that, right? And then in a more basic way, I think a lot of times when people think of protest, they have this image in their mind of people with signs, we're out in the street, we're marching against something, but just objecting to mistreatment. If you're trying to protest being put out on the street, if you're trying to protest being evicted or being treated unfairly, you're about to hear from Wendell in just a moment about his experience with this very thing, and you try to protest your treatment, who shows up? The sheriff's department, the police, right? So even in just protesting your treatment on a more basic level, you don't even have to be thinking of yourself as an activist. You don't have to be participating in any kind of civil disobedience. You're just simply protesting for your right to exist, and you are met with this kind of repression. So imagine if our state goes forward with basically outlawing your freedom of speech, outlawing our ability to protest. How will you defend yourself in any kind of way? It's very basic to me. It's so fundamental. And like I said, I think the housing issue intersects with so many other things. A lot of times people think these things are separate, but they're not separate at all. And we don't view it as separate either. So we are here to talk about that. And we definitely believe in building a movement, not just for housing justice, but for justice, period, right? We're trying to organize our communities for various things, but we can't organize our community if our community is being displaced. And so I would love to go to Wendell. Were we able to connect with Wendell? Hi, Wendell. Thank you so much
Okay.
for joining us and sharing your story. So I was just telling everybody about the unjust treatment that people are experiencing, and the fact that we have to be able, how do we challenge unjust treatment if we don't have the ability to protest or object? And so I was wondering if you could share with us your experience, which we know represents so many thousands of people across North Carolina. Can you start by telling us about where you are currently living and how you came to live there?
Yeah, I live in Burlington. Uh, well, my story is kind of different because of my landlord. She won't fix nothing, and I'm just and she was charging me over the amount the rent was. So I mean, I've just been having problems far as the electric in here and my plumbing, things of that nature.
And so your situation, Wendell, is like a lot of people's actually. One of the campaigns I was involved with in Charlotte was in Lake Arbor, which was a situation where they were paying their rent. And that's the other thing. I think sometimes people assume that if folks are struggling with housing, it's because they're not paying rent. No, people are paying rent, but the landlords aren't making repairs, right? Isn't that the situation for you, Wendell? You have a landlord who is not repairing the utilities.
Yes, that's my situation, and also, like I said, she said the house is supposed to be condemned, and but she didn't have no proof of that. And then she claimed that I'm doing a lot of illegal things, and she lies on me. I mean, we went to court about it, so they dismissed it as far as that. But what I'm saying is this: I wish that that the HOPE program was supposed to help me out, and that's the governor's program, and they didn't come through. So that left me, as far as my electricity and all that type of stuff, they never helped me. But I signed a contract for them to do it, and they was supposed to pay my electric, and they didn't. And the landlord wouldn't accept no rent from them because because he said the house was supposed to be condemned, but that's not true.
And so
that's why I said
and so for folks who are watching, if you're not familiar, the HOPE program, this was like the federal assistance money that came to the states that was supposed to be given to folks who were impacted by the pandemic and facing eviction. But what has happened is you had a lot of people like Wendell. They qualified, they applied for it. In some cases, they got approved like Wendell did, but the money still didn't come through. The money didn't come through to the utility company. And in Wendell's case, his landlord refused to accept the money. So then what is he supposed to do? Wendell, can you share with us, like, why has it been difficult to find stable housing? Can you just talk about some of the factors that has made it difficult to find safe, stable, affordable housing here?
Well, you talking about in Burlington?
Yeah, in Burlington.
Yes, the housing market is tight. There's nobody moving, and as far as renting, it's very expensive. It seemed like they just went up after the COVID hit. It seemed like they went up another few $100, just for rent, so make it so a person can't afford it. So that's my situation too.
And
that's another situation,
And you came to Burlington. You came to Burlington originally because you had a relative you had to look after, right? What brought you to Burlington?
Relative. No, it was just. No, I don't understand what you're saying. Just explain. Say it again.
She's just asking how you came about to live in Burlington.
Well, me and my wife, we moved from D.C. down here because my mother-in-law was sick, and when she died with cancer, so we stayed down here. And but we went back to D.C. to stay, and that up in D.C. the rent is real high to stay there. So we came back here to stay like 3 years ago, and we stayed in a little room. And when this property manager told me that he had a house for rent, and he charged me $700, which the house was number $500. So I paid that for a whole year and a half until I found out until COVID came. And that's when the landlord started accepting $500. So, it made me think that, rent don't go down, it always go up. So that was a scam they did on me. So, for me and my wife. And now my wife is hospitalized, and it ain't her income is going to the rehabilitation place that she stay in, and I don't have but one income. So
and
it really is making it hard, huh?
I'm sorry, and you are living with a disability yourself, isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am. I'm on disability, and I mean, even the ramp that I'm supposed to have hooked up to my house, she haven't done anything about that, I mean, she just won't fix nothing in this house. You know, I don't have, like, my lights don't work, and my electric on, but my lights don't work, so I have to use a lamp. You know, I mean, it's just terrible, and the plumbing is bad in here. You know, and she won't fix anything.
Can you tell us about how you got 72 hours notice at one point before you're being evicted?
The property manager, my wife, her check didn't come 1 month, and the property manager, he had came and he had tried to force us out in 72 hours. He ain't tried to take us to court or nothing. And that's when I met Attorney Jamie, and she helped me out, you know, for that situation. But they gave me 72 hours to move out. You know, I mean, the lease, they had that on the lease, you know, after I signed the lease. And you know, they just was crooked. So, I mean, that's it. I mean, like I said, I was paying $700 when I was just supposed to pay $500. So they did, like you said, they gave me 72 hours to move, and then they tried to force me out of here, but I didn't. But then my wife didn't go. That's when I met Attorney James.
And then with being in a wheelchair, how difficult is it for you to have to go to court or all the places that you have to go to in order to fight back?
I have an electric wheelchair, but at one time I just had a portable wheelchair. But still, the ramp that I had to get somebody to fix this ramp for me, and it's not stable. So with it rain, I really can't go nowhere because the ramp is really slippery. You know, because I done failed about 3-4 times on this ramp. And she won't. She keep on saying that she's going to try to build a ramp, but she didn't. So it's hard for me to get around as far as transportation.
Yes, no. We thank you so much for sharing it. Wendell's situation is representative of so many thousands of people. There was, in fact, someone else who wanted to join tonight to share, but she's also has medical issues and she has to take care of her health. And so, Wendell, it's so wonderful that you are able to be here and to give voice to so many people who can't be here. I'm wondering, Yolanda and Jamie, if you can join in and just talk about, like, through your experience of
Wendell,
representing people like Wendell, how
I'll give you a call back.
how representative this case is of so many people, and especially the populations that are most vulnerable to the housing justice issue, right? He's living with a disability, the way that people who struggle to find stable housing can be exploited in the ways that Wendell is. Can you speak to that, either one of you?
Sure, but I'm happy if you want to go first, Yolanda.
Oh, it doesn't matter. I mean, I can or you can. I'll start. Well, I was going to say that Wendell's situation is definitely one in many cases that I've seen as a lawyer, especially as a former lawyer at Legal Aid of North Carolina, where housing and landlord-tenant work is the predominance of our work. I mean, we're used to seeing these housing injustices, right? We're seeing the injustice, but as lawyers in an organization like Legal Aid, you know, we're just limited to looking at the individual case by case, you know, examples that come through our doors. So it's like we're putting Band-Aid on something that requires surgery, but and to ground it in why we're here today, the House Bill 805, I mean, that's the reason why we need to, you know, animately protest this bill, you know, for lack of a better word. We need to protest this bill because the only way we can change laws that are really created for those in power, and they seem to typically favor landlords, is to have this change from the ground up. So yeah, so we're used to seeing those who are disabled, those who are working but maybe low wealth workers, those who may be seniors trying to age in place, or those who may have just had a hard time. I mean, we're coming out of a pandemic and evictions were still occurring. So nothing that Wendell expressed is surprising to me. Unfortunately, you know, when I was at Legal Aid, you know, it was just another client replacing another client with the same story. So we're talking about systemic issues that the people in the grassroots movement has to really tackle and push back on in order to change the unjust housing system that we're seeing.
Yeah, everything that you say for sure is exactly the experience that I have. It's an unusual circumstance when a lawyer goes and picks up her client at his house, and those are the circumstances that I'm frequently faced with when working with people with housing issues, because they are sitting at the intersections that we talk about when we talk about intersectionality. Wendell is a Black man. His wife is a Black woman. They're elderly. They're, well, that may be a little bit extreme. I mean, he's older. They're both disabled and multiple disabilities, and folks who, have not ever really had, their socioeconomic status has never been as high as I'm sure that they would like for it to be. And when I encounter a circumstance, I mean, Wendell didn't speak of it, but there was a point where his landlord actually, she hired this property manager, and he literally tried to kick down the door when Wendell wasn't out in 72 hours. And I told him, they cannot force you to leave without going through the legal process. And to get around the eviction moratorium, his landlord made an allegation that he was a holdover tenant, even though she didn't have a copy of the lease that she had him sign, and then claimed that he was engaged in criminal activity and alleged that he was dealing drugs. And I can well assure everybody on this call that Mr. Wendell is not dealing drugs. He never was dealing drugs. It was just when she went into court, the magistrate said, "What evidence do you have? Have you ever called the police, filed a police report?" And she said, "Nope." And the magistrate instantly dismissed the case. And then that's when this landlord started to take this, it was a letter from the planning people that said, "Your house is not fit for human habitation. You need to fix it." She took it to the Burlington City Police and told them he was a trespasser, that the house had been condemned, and that they had to throw him out. And I spent pretty much a whole day talking to anybody at the city of Burlington that would listen to me, that it's not appropriate to accept a document from a private individual. That's not how condemnation works. They're certainly not gonna, that goes through the sheriff's office. But I say all of that because, he's been, this has been going on now. I got in contact with him September of 2020, and it's now mid-July. And thankfully he's still in place, but it has been constant effort on his part, frequent effort on my part, and effort from the entire community. There are people who, on occasion bring anything that he needs, whether it's cleaning supplies or food. Sometimes he just needs somebody to come sit with him. He and his wife just celebrated their 37th anniversary, and she's in the hospital. She just had her leg removed. And it kind of all comes back to me to an event we held in Graham at the end of 2020 to lift up these issues. It was a demonstration that was held right in the town square, where so many folks have been arrested unlawfully. And thankfully there was no interference from either the Graham Police Department or the Alamance County Sheriff's Office. But one never knows when one goes to Graham whether one is going to face, or everybody is going to face, these issues where somebody's standing, crossing the street and they get a face full of pepper spray, or if they're going to yell, something like "F the police," and they're going to end up in jail. And so it's really important that even for something like housing justice, which doesn't automatically call to mind, I think, for people, the involvement of law enforcement, but it actually is, there is heavy law enforcement involvement. If a person is evicted, it's the sheriff's office that comes and removes them. And so being able to protest what's happening, the power of landlords that are using the power of the state to protect their own property rights is really important. And it's been what I think our state coalition has been sort of, in my mind anyway, moving towards, maybe some more direct action and some more radical events, because really, I think for people to hear our voices, frequently we have to be out in the streets.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's important to point out for everyone watching that a lot of folks don't get a Yolanda or Jamie to show up because the caseload is so great. Like, isn't that correct? Like the need for representation is greater than attorneys like Yolanda and Jamie are able to even provide. So for every Wendell, there's other people who are going through the same situation, but maybe don't have somebody who's able to defend them and protect them. And to that point, Yolanda, I'm wondering, can you talk some about the concept of what is legal versus what is just? Because I think a lot of times people assume, well, something is the law, right? But just because something is the law or is legal doesn't mean that it's right, right?
Yeah, sure, definitely. And before I get into that, I just want to quote one of my favorite quotes. Those of you who know me, it's by John A. Powell. He's a think tank guy, and he's a leading national expert in civil rights, housing, and racial discrimination. He's quoted as saying that housing sits at the core of a system of multiple institutions that reproduce inequities. And why? Because housing and where you live matters. I mean, it determines, as we know, your access to good paying jobs, your access to healthcare, quality and affordable daycare, transportation, access to healthy foods, and it even determines your lifespan. I mean, there are maps I've done in my work that can show the closer you live to urban areas versus maybe a rural community determines how long you will live. I mean, like, for example, it's all about the closer you live to these amenities that are in urban areas like jobs and healthcare and education. I believe it's actually a disparity of 8 to 10 years between Raleigh and a community like Wilson and Rocky Mount. So there are deep intersections between housing and the right to protest these injustices in housing. So when we talk about what's illegal and what's just, I mean, for example, you heard Mr. Wendell's stories, right? And as I stated earlier, these laws that establish the rights and the obligations of tenants and landlords are made by those who are in power at our General Assembly. And sometimes laws are made by those that are in power. I should say oftentimes they work against those who have no power. But put a pin in this, we do have power collectively, and we know this. And they know this, that collectively we are dangerous, right? So anything to chill that collective impact and that collective action, I think is what our opponents and those who want to, I guess, yield a backlash against any progress that Black and Brown and Indigenous people have made in society, that's their game plan. But when you talk about folks like Mr. Wendell being evicted from their homes, they have to have this awkward, uncomfortable, and embarrassing interaction with the sheriff's office, who is part of law enforcement. And oftentimes the sheriff will come into their homes and forcibly remove residents from their homes. So let's just say, and I'm not saying that this bill will do all this, but the way it's written, it's kind of shady, House Bill 805. So let's say if there's more than 3 family residents in a home who are protesting their forcible eviction from their home, and maybe they have their allies there, like Jamie, like Bree, and other advocates who have done this in real life, supported those tenants who are being evicted. That can be deemed a riot, all because someone is trying to keep and maintain the human dignity and security that a house provides. So to get to the initial thought that I was going to land is that when you talk about what's legal and what's just, so I want to quote Martin Luther King Jr. He states that one has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. So arguably, when we're in the streets and making it our streets at that moment, we are disobeying unjust laws, or we're pushing for the right to be heard around, how these unjust laws have impacted our communities and our streets. King further goes on to say, I agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. And I want to say today that I agree with King that if HB 805 passes, it's an unjust bill currently, whose proponents are hoping that it will become an unjust law. And in my opinion, it's no law at all. And it's a law that I think, even though we're talking here today about how this bill may chill the impact of protesters, I know we're still going to protest it, right? So the right to assemble and protest is not just a fundamental right under, our United States Constitution, but it's an essential right that undergirds our ability, I feel, to even participate in democracy. And when King talks about unjust and what's legal, he defines what's unjust and what's legal. He says any law that uplifts human personality or human dignity and character is just. Any law that degrades human personality and character is unjust. So this bill, in and on its face, and as you've heard throughout the day, if you've been with us, was created by those who are, I hate to say it's a white lash against the protest from George Floyd. They stated that clearly when they were talking about the creation of this bill and why this bill was needed. But we have a right to be included in the democracy of our country, our city, our local government, and especially in a country that we help build. We have a right to the human decency of quality, clean, and affordable housing in any part of town in which we desire to live. And that's the fair housing part that King fought for. We have a right to the pursuit of happiness as citizens of this country, and as those who are pursuing citizenship, arguably. And that is, to me, the freedom from unwarranted harassment by police and legislation that's attempting to chill our speech and to chill our power. And we know that Black people have historically been excluded from democracy. And now Brown and Indigenous people feel the same sting from the denial of democracy and access to opportunity. So the streets are, to most of us, that's all we got. The streets is all we got. And they know this, and they are afraid of this. And we know that sustainable change comes from the ground up as well. So the fight, I feel, in a march for anti-eviction policies, laws, and affordable housing, I think will be impacted by this bill and could, as many have said, deter citizens, from participating if they feel like they may get arrested. And Bree mentioned that there was another person who I work closely with that couldn't be here tonight because she's not feeling well. Just recently, she and others in Raleigh, North Carolina, they're part of the Wake County Housing Justice Coalition. All they did was assemble in front of the city council hall, and already the police was monitoring them and their actions. All they did was speak up at the local city council meeting, and one participant clapped, because of what the other person had said was so good, which it was, as it related to gentrification and affordable housing issues in Raleigh. The mayor stopped what she was doing and sicked the police on, someone just for clapping. So what we're saying is not something that we're dreaming up. It's not something that we are trying to scare people into believing that could happen. These things happen every day. So, so when we're talking about housing and the systemic issues faced by, I think, Jamie, your client, Mr. Wendell, we know that, his circumstance, if you look deeper, is systemic. There's a huge racial wealth gap in this country as well. So, and people may look at circumstances. I've had people look at my clients the same way, like, well, or it's their fault that they're in this situation. No, it's systemic. Again, it's there. We know that there's years and decades of economic discrimination in this country that undergirds everything that's been discussed today.
Can I say something to that real quick, Yolanda? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think you touched on such like a key thing. Like one of the things I'm really concerned about in this time period is like there's all this talk about democracy being under threat and we've got to save democracy, but I think we have to really examine what is democracy? What does that mean? Because see, we can go through the motions of what looks like a democracy and people thinking that we have a democracy just because some people are able to vote, right? Or the city council is having a meeting and you're allowed to attend. But if our votes don't count, right? If there's police suppression when you show up at city council, right? If they are outlawing essentially our ability to assemble and protest, then it's not really a democracy. And I think we have to understand, like, democracy is not simply voting, right?
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of totalitarian regimes around the world that have voting. They have elections every year. The dictator always wins in a landslide, right? Because it's not really a democracy. And one of the other things that I noticed kind of to this issue of like space and housing that we've been seeing a lot, especially in places like Charlotte, is not only are we being pushed out of the homes, but they're also taking away our community spaces. So like,
Yes.
like how we used to, if we have like community centers where we meet and organize, they're also taking that away. And that is also deliberate and really kind of like restricting our ability to organize.
That's so true, Bree. And like you say, how do we define democracy? Democracy doesn't belong solely to those who are elected, and like you say, it's not just about the process of voting. It's about our ability to participate in the day-to-day decisions that impact our daily lives. The government is supposed to be made for the people, by the people. So the people should have access to speak. And the one of the other things I want to lift as it relates to democracy is like the importance, of our ability to speak, in a public forum, right? In a public forum with those who are like-minded and those who are in line with us to accomplish the same mission. I mean, that's so important because right now in society, we're living in a society where history is being rewritten. People are changing the narratives. When you even look at January 6th, what are my kids going to read about January 6th down the line? Because they're already changing and shifting that narrative. So it's important that we are able to speak, because that's sometimes our only time that we, like Mr. Wendell, we get an opportunity to really share our lived experience and the truths that we stand on. So, and when we tell our stories, we don't glorify the hunter. We glorify the lion, who's us. It's our war, and it's the things that have impacted us that we're able to speak about. And that's one thing too. So I think some of this, has to do with them trying to just shift the narrative. That's being embraced by this country finally, right?
I participated in a school board meeting a couple of weeks ago in Alamance County. And at the beginning of the school board meeting, an announcement was made that anybody who interrupted the meeting would be subject to arrest on, I think, like a class 2 misdemeanor or something like that. And at one point, there was a massive disruption of somebody who was there wearing a Mark Robinson shirt. She was a white woman who was speaking against critical race theory. And the police had to escort her out of the building, but she was not criminally charged. Whereas last year, I had a client who was speaking at a public hearing on a new UPS facility that they were about to build in Graham, or they were discussing, and the chair of the county commissioners interrupted her while she was talking. And the sheriff's office literally just grabbed her from the lectern and dragged her away and cited her for interrupting a public meeting. And I think RDO, resist, delay, and obstruct was the other charge. And so and the person who was speaking for the UPS facility is white, but is a Black Lives Matter protester. And the person who was speaking at this school board meeting was certainly not either. Well, she was not a Black Lives Matter protester. And so I think it's really hard for people sitting in those seats to really even see their own sort of internal hypocrisy, that the announcement was really made to say, if you're coming here to speak, on behalf of critical race theory, you better not interrupt our meeting. But not understanding that the actual offense of interrupting a public meeting should apply whomever is engaged in it. And so when you're, present at these events and see this inequity occurring before your eyes and are sort of gaslighted into, people denying that it's even occurring, it does get incredibly frustrating. But one of the things that I think is really foundational to our government is the ability to participate in our democracy. And voting is an excellent way to do that, but it's certainly not the only way. And going to meetings and being able to speak freely about your experiences is really how I think we push our elected officials.
You're muted, Yolanda.
I was just saying, yeah, I definitely agree too that, this fight and this collective action that we spent all day as a community uplifting is essentially about this continuous combat we must wage against unjust laws and the protection of our democracy, right? Democracy is just not for some, it's for all. Just because you have a flag doesn't necessarily mean you're a patriot. I can go on and on about that. But as an attorney like you, Jamie, who does community lawyering in support of community movements, I'm deeply concerned about how this may impact community movements. And you lifted the implicit bias, the stereotypes, the racial stereotypes that those who are in law enforcement may have if they see us gathering, right? To have a different level of punishment for the same act, in plain view. That happens all the time. That's why we're in the streets. But I think Bree and I and Jamie, we just wanted to center that this bill, can impact all of our lives in various areas, not just criminal justice, but housing as well. And we know that housing has a historic origin. Martin Luther King in 1966, after fighting for voter rights in Selma, he moved to Chicago and he stated that we have to, do something about, and at the time they call them ghettos and slums, that was the language used in his day, that we have to do something because he saw that housing was that next thing that next battle that needed to be waged in order to grant true equality, for everyone and economic opportunity. So housing, is not just a human right, it's protected under civil rights laws in this country. And we should have the right to protest, to preserve it, and to fight for better laws and policies.
And can I emphasize again, one, I think it's important to recognize that, at the founding of this nation, democracy was not extended to everyone. We know that, right? And in its very first iteration, it was reserved for landed white men. So like, even if you were white, but if you didn't own land, you couldn't participate. So this whole idea of like us being able to participate and our ability to participate based on our ability to claim ownership to a land is very, very much intertwined. And I just want to emphasize again, like, this is something I say to people often, again, because a lot of people, if they know me, it's because of, civil disobedience that I did, right? And I think a lot of times the perception is that protest and civil disobedience, we only do that when stuff is wrong. But what I think it's key for everybody to understand is that even in a functioning democracy where everything is like, for the most part, great, we have housing, we have education, like, we still should have the right to civil disobedience and protest and assembly and speaking, because those are constant things. Those are constant ways of engaging in the democracy. Again, it's not just about voting. And my concern about this idea that democracy is only when we go and we vote and then we deal with whatever the outcome is, right? Is not only does it misunderstand democracy, but it even misunderstands how we got voting rights, right? We didn't vote our way to voting rights. We were supposed to have had voting rights ever since the 1865 or whenever they first instituted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but those rights were not honored. Right. And so people had to protest, they had to march, they had to engage in civil disobedience and economic disruption for us to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is now the very act that is being attacked. in terms of trying to strip us of our voting rights. So I just think it's really important. I think a lot of times people think, well, I'm not an activist, right? I'm not the one to protest. I'll even have people say to me, like, I appreciate so much what you're doing out there, but they see themselves as removed from it. And I think it's really important for everyone to recognize you're not removed from it. Like, when you vote, that is a political act. When you send a letter to your elected official, that is a political act. Showing up at the school board, these are all things that we have to constantly do. And protest is a healthy part of that. One of the ways that you can tell a healthy democracy from a non-democracy is whether or not people are able to assemble, right? I mean, that's one of like the very clearest hallmarks of an oppressive government, is one where people are not allowed to assemble in public, wherever you may stand. If you want to show up at the school board and protest critical race theory, I disagree with you, but that's certainly within your right and freedom of speech, right? And if we have a situation where people can't do that, that is one of the greatest hallmarks. Again, like I said, we've got to be careful. There, in a totalitarian regime, you have people vote, hold elections. They hold elections as part of the way of validating what is an invalid government, right? So even more so than the ability to vote, the ability to protest is really the marker of whether or not we have a functioning democracy.
And there's no doubt in my mind that this bill is intended to prevent this exact kind of protest that's been going on in Raleigh, in Charlotte, in Graham, to make people afraid that if they go out, that they're going to be subject to felonies where the action would have just been a misdemeanor in the past. And law enforcement has so much discretion. I think that's one of the other pieces that I think people don't really recognize, is that whether somebody's breaking the law is frequently not black and white. There are things like throwing a brick through a window is probably a pretty good indication that criminal activity has occurred. But frequently the things that are happening in Graham, for example, where I've been present the most, that's why I refer to it, is somebody, cursing. And there was recently a settlement where Terry Johnson, the sheriff of Alamance County, actually admitted in the settlement that cursing is not a crime. But there were at least 3 of my clients were arrested just for using the F word. And so the idea that that's, I think, frequently uplifted from the other side is that we are, engaged in criminal activity when we're out protesting, and therefore we deserve whatever law enforcement decides to mete out on us. And frequently I've seen people on megaphones, speaking and being dragged away. Somebody participating in a public hearing, which is pretty much, I thought, the idea behind the Constitution was to give us that ability, being pulled away from a lectern and charged. And these are not, if you think about how you want the Constitution to look, or at least if I think about how I want it to look, I certainly don't want it to look like somebody should be arrested for, upsetting the chair of a county commissioner's meeting because the county commissioner didn't like what she had to say. That's not the appropriate use of police power. And so that type of offense could be enhanced. It'll be more difficult to get people out of that. Part of this new bill actually prohibits a magistrate from setting release conditions. And so I was a magistrate in Orange County from 2015 to 2017. And the only other charges that had a similar restriction was domestic violence. And so to treat somebody protesting their rights the same as somebody who's engaged in a cycle of domestic violence is already, a pretty horrible false equivalency. And it's sort of, again, sort of gaslighting the entire population into thinking that people out speaking for their rights are criminals, as opposed to people who are just speaking out on their rights.
Yeah, that's so true. And I just want to ground as we wrap up here that we've already seen how law enforcement subjectively determines whether or not they're encountering an imminent threat, right? We've seen how that has played out in the news. Well, this law here too will be a law that will give law enforcement the discretion, to implement or charge someone, with rioting or inciting a riot. And as was stated earlier, some of you may not have seen that earlier today. The Southern Coalition for Social Justice Lawyers also broke down this act. But I want to highlight here that, the language is so loose, and I'm sure you're going to hear that again by our next panelists, but it states that, just the imminent threat of disorderly and violent conduct that results in injury or damage, could be, characterized under this. And we've heard a lot about how this can disenfranchise voters, if they are convicted of a felony. Well, I know as a former legal aid attorney, I did a lot of expunction work, and I did expunctions for the sole purpose of helping people obtain jobs and housing. I was trying to clean up their criminal records so they can have these economic opportunities. Well, the collateral damage that can come from this House Bill 805 as it relates to housing is that it can make it hard for people to access housing. We know that landlords look at criminal records. So especially if you have a felony, I mean, that's depending on what type of felony it is. I mean, it's difficult to expunge. You might not ever get it expunged, and therefore that will cause a denial to your ability to have the human right of housing. And I guess the last thing I also wanted to say was that, I think we all believe on this face, this policy is unjust. But to those of you who have some doubt, you got to think about who will it benefit and who will it burden. Who will it benefit and who will it burden? We already know there's going to be disproportionate impacts to those of us who are in the streets fighting for systemic change in all these various issues we've lifted today. So that's why, we believe that this is an unjust law. And lastly, I want to just thank Bree and Jamie for being on this panel with me today. And I hope you guys were able to understand, the aspects of housing and what we're fighting for in the streets, and why all these issues are important to our ultimate liberation and freedom in America. I want to end with another quote by MLK Jr. He stated that we must make constant use of the freedom we already possess. So I know we feel free-ish, but we do have some freedom. So we must make constant use of the freedom we already possess. And that freedom will be to continue to lift our voices, tell our stories, and combat unjust laws. Thank you.
Thank y'all so much. Can I just add real quick, if you want to connect to the statewide housing network, just shoot us an email, needahome2stayathome@gmail.com. That's needahome2stayathome@gmail.com.